think about this. You know, I was so. When I talk about being a different person, like now people tweet at me. I almost never tweet back. I try to avoid that. In my very first book, before the internet was so central to everything, I put my home phone number in that book, thinking no one would ever call us. But of course, many people did. You know, like many people did.
He is the ethicist from the Sunday New York Times Magazine, as well as being the author of several collections of essays and 2 novels. Chuck Klosterman has written for GQ, Spin, The Guardian, Esquire, The Washington Post, as well as covering sports for ESPN. He is, to say the least, a man of many talents and many tastes. We caught up with him in his new hometown of New York City. Chuck, I've been reading your stuff for the last several weeks, sort of getting ready for this, and it occurred to me as I was doing this that something was happening to me that I'm wondering if it happened to you when you were doing the interviews that you've written about, and that is you almost over-prepare to the point where you've done too much and you don't know where to start. So, and I was thinking, where do I start with this guy? And I thought, oh, I know, I'll start there. Has that ever happened to you?
Yeah, it happens more when I felt when I was a younger journalist. I'm not so much like that now because what the problem is if you over prepare, or even if you just prepare really well. Okay, on the one side, of course, you're more informed about the person. Logically, that should be the way to do it. But you start separating yourself from the person who's going to actually consume the material. Like there have been musicians that I was interviewing Radiohead one time, and I was flying over to England, and I was, I read that he just read a Naomi Klein book. So I was reading this super long Naomi Klein book.
You read No Logo?
Yes.
Just to get ready for the interview?
In preparation to interview Tom York.
Oh.
And it never came up, of course.
Of course not.
I think I tried to get into the interview at one point, and he was like, yeah, that book exists or whatever. So I was like, well, why am I doing that? Why don't I get closer to the experience of the person who's interested in this, who has a pre-existing knowledge of this person through their art, but wants to sort of be able to kind of inject a different kind of perspective into that experience. So now the other problem is that at this point in time, because of the internet, there are so many interviews with everyone.
That's right. Yeah.
It's nuts. I mean, like the average guy in the Strokes has been interviewed more than George Harrison prior to 1970. I think that's totally true because of the amplification of media. And the result is all these interviews start becoming identical because journalists feel an obligation to re-ask things that have been addressed before.
Absolutely.
So I'm always trying to do like the new kind of conversation.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's weird. Maybe I'm just rationalizing a way not to do work, but it seems to be to my benefit if I just go in there and I ask the questions that existed before I even considered doing a story.
Well, in fact, it occurred to me as I was reading your stuff that I had no intention of asking you about any of the stuff that you've written, really. Yeah. Maybe once or twice I might throw something in this conversation we're going to have, but essentially that's not... What I did find interesting, as you wrote about the process of interviewing and being interviewed, that you used a term that I've been doing this now for 46 years, and you used a term, and I thought, that's exactly what interviewing is. It was accelerated intimacy. Mm-hmm. It's this idea that what we're doing here, speaking as if we've known each other for a long time when we just met like 5 minutes ago when you walked in the door. And the fact that your name is Chuck and not Charles even makes that seem more intimate because you're Chuck. You're not
I guess,
Charles.
That's true.
Yeah.
I guess I'm always... confused but pleasantly surprised that people who've never met me do feel they can call me Chuck immediately. Yeah. Nobody ever calls me Mr. Anything.
Yeah.
Or anything.
But if you were a Charles, I bet you they would.
Maybe. I don't know. That's an interesting perspective, I guess. What I found, my life changed so dramatically in such a short window of time that I do feel that I was able to have not a unique but a relatively rarefied perspective on interviewing. Because I had spent 8 years as a newspaper writer. I had begun sort of as a magazine writer, and all of a sudden this succession of books came up, particularly the second book, was extremely popular, and the polarity just got totally reversed. And suddenly I was being interviewed far more often than I was actually interviewing people, which felt, and I really, at the time, this has been like the early 2000s, I really self-identified as a journalist. That was like my identity was that. So it felt weird that this had changed, but it was good in a way, in many ways, I suppose, but principally because it really gave me a different understanding of how it feels to be asked questions by a stranger that are going to ultimately become the average person's understanding of you in totality. Yeah. It made me more sympathetic, I guess, to a lot of people I interviewed. In a way, it might have made me a weaker interviewer in that maybe I'm a little less aggressive, but I think it also made me better in that I'm much more fair now.
Yes.
I mean, especially when in newspaper culture, it was just sort of ingrained in your mind to get as much as you can, to find whatever the interesting detail is and like find the string and just pull it, even if that is a slight misinterpretation of what the person's really like. You're almost looking for mistakes.
Yes.
I don't feel like I do that anymore.
The other thing about too, just thinking of this as you were speaking, I found this when I attempted to write something many years ago. I had a book out in the 90s, and I was asked at the time to make it a narrative based on interviews that I had done with well-known Canadian cultural figures. And I had a really hard time with it because journalistically, being trained journalistically, you're trained not to put yourself in there at all. And this editor kept saying to me, no, you've got to, they were talking to you, you've got to put yourself in there. And I kept thinking, why the hell would anyone care about that? It's really hard to get over that hump. I managed to get over it and do it, but it still felt sort of weird to do that.
It's tough, this idea of, why would anyone care? Because you can say that about anything.
Sure.
There's really, if that, or if you're writing a book and somebody says, well, why does this book need to exist? Well, there's no good argument against that. But, there's a documentary about the font Helvetica. And it's interesting.
I know, I've seen it.
So it's like it's all the execution. Yeah. When you're in newspapers, of course, there is a particular adversarial relationship with first-person writing and personal writing. So I think when I wrote my first book, initially it felt a little freeing because I was like, well, I know that I don't have to follow these rules all day long. I kind of write these stories in a detached, way, and now I'm writing this book that's sort of more about, closer to who I am. Well, even then, though, I assumed that if I was going to write a book about, heavy metal music, in the late 90s, which is what I was doing, that it would have to almost be academic in some way. So I was actually trying to write an academic book.
Okay.
And I had written 100 and some pages, which is just sort of like kind of analysis of metal as it appeals to rural culture. And I started sending it to academic presses. And a woman, I wish I could find this woman. I don't even know her name anymore. I lost the letter from the Columbia University Press. She wrote me this great letter back, and she's like, well, I can't publish this book for two reasons. One is that you swear way too much in this copy, and as is an academic press. But also, she said, the most interesting parts of this are when you use your own experience, which I was totally doing just out of necessity. Like, there's no academic precedent for writing about the band Tesla or about rats. You can't go back and research this. So I'd just be like, oh, my friend Duke liked rats, and this is how it affected him. So I was like, well, okay, I'll do that. So then I wrote another 150 pages of pure memoir stuff, just my memories of listening to this music. Then I chopped that all up and chopped the other part all up, put it in sequential order, and that was the book.
Wow. Yeah. You have acknowledged that when you've been interviewed as the person being talked to, that you have upon occasion lied, and it's funny because when I read that I thought, this happened to me too when I've known it once in an interview in which the person, a Canadian playwright, I knew everything about his personal life and his childhood and what prompted him to write the plays that he wrote because, well, it was part of the public record, but also because his agent happened to be my agent. And yet in the interview, he denied all of it and told a completely different story. And I just sat there, there was nothing I could do. It was his life.
That's a different kind of lying, though. I don't feel like I lied about facts in interviews. Okay. But what happened is, and I've seen it in other people, this is like I say, like the kind of good fortune of seeing it through other people. Say I'm interviewing Jack White from the White Stripes. Yep. I guess now he's a solo artist. I interviewed him, and I was really intrigued by his guitar soloing, and I had all this. I had all these ideas about what this guitar soloing represented or meaning or what he was trying to go after. And then when I talked to him, it became abundantly obvious to me that playing guitar is the one part of his life that's just a natural, organic extension. Yeah. It's actually the thing he doesn't need to think about as a product that he's creating, so that's why it's good. So very often as a writer, you could ask questions that I realize that I have not really ever considered, and yet they seem like so central to the experience, I have to say something. So somebody will ask me like, well, why did you write this book, or why did you make this decision? And I will find myself constructing an answer that sounds like someone like me would say. Even though then I'll later think to myself, it's like, that wasn't true at all. I didn't feel that way at any point. So what I'm really lying about, I guess, are my feelings.
It's funny you mentioned Jack White, because you've said about him that he was one of the rare people who was, I don't know, I guess obstreperous would be the word, where if you said something about one of his guitar solos reminding you of something else,
Yes.
he'd say, no, you're wrong, it's this. But if you said that, he'd say, no, you're wrong, it's this. And I was put in mind of that because recently we went to Fort Wayne, Indiana, of all places, and shot a piece with David Crosby. And prior to the interview, luckily this wasn't on air, though he did stick me a couple of times while we were actually taping. But prior to it, we're making small talk as we're getting mic'd up and stuff. And last year we shot a piece with Graham Nash in Santa Monica in Jackson Brown's recording studio, and all of Crosby's new album was recorded there. So just make small talk. I said, so you recorded this in Jackson Brown's studio? And he looked at me and said, no. Like, and I thought, we haven't even started the interview yet, and he's just baldly lying to me. Why would he do this? But it was his way of, I guess, sort of maintaining control over what was... Because at one point he did say to me, this is my interview, he said to me.
I mean, in his mind, maybe, it's sort of like, we recorded this in a studio. It happens to be owned by Jackson Brown. I don't want to have this be seen as my work as a reflection. You know, because that's like Jack. There are a lot of artists like this, and I understand this. Maybe I feel this way sometimes. Yet you have a real fear of being led. That you don't want the person to be able to create who you are. So when they ask you a question, particularly if it's something you've been asked a lot about, the first thing you say is, of course, well, no, that's not actually accurate. So some people, if you really want them to get them to speak, I found, to speak freely, is you start out acting like you don't believe what you're really asking about. Like if you were talking to David Crosby and you said like, now, I realize you're not really a political person. That's sort of what you do for a musical show. And then I'm guessing he would be like, no, I am political, and here's why.
Exactly.
So sometimes I will ask people the exact, like I will imply that I believe the opposite of what the facts are, which is a little bit manipulative. I mean, that's the whole thing with journalism. It's like, I do fear that in some ways, at its really core, it is an ultimately a somewhat unethical pursuit, and yet it's what I do for a living.
Yeah, no, I know exactly how you feel. I want to ask you about writing the ethics column in the Sunday Times Magazine because, well, first of all, let me ask you about taking it on. Did you hesitate at all in taking over that job?
Well, what happened was a new guy took over the magazine, and when he took it over, he contacted me, and he wanted me to write a column, but it was not that column.
Okay.
It was a column called, I believe, Either Or. And like the premise would be, you know, what's better, the iPad or Sarah Palin's shoulder pads? Like there'd be some sort of kind of like, I was a strange, intriguing idea, but I was like, I can't do it actually. I just took a job at ESPN. I'm not really in a position to take this on. I was like, if I could ever do The Ethicist, that is the job I would love. Because first time I ever saw that column when I moved to New York, I was like, this is so interesting that, you know, it's instead of having to work through, you know, a 4,000-word essay to get to the crux of the problem, it's like the crux is the problem.
Yeah.
And then some time passed. The person who was doing The Ethicist, you know, left, or I don't know what happened, was fired or whatever happened, moved to a different, I think she moved to a different place in the newspaper. And the opportunity was there. So when I had it, I was like, I want to do this. I mean, I pursued it. I did not...
Really?
Yeah, I pursued it.
No, I'm curious about that because why? Every week I read it and I think, okay, there's some really interesting things that get asked here. I particularly liked, of course, being Canadian. There was somebody very recently who asked you about the ethics of taking a selfie with Rob Ford if it was being taken ironically, which I thought was an interesting question. But I thought, God, you know, who would want to be in the position to be offering up some kind of moral guidelines for all these people who write in? Like, don't sometimes you think, am I really giving the right advice here?
Oh, well, this might be a strange answer, but I think I might take it a little less seriously than some of the people who consume it. I mean, to me, I still look at it as fundamentally it's a newspaper column, right? Like, I'm not a trained ethicist. I'm a reporter, okay? What can I do? Well, if somebody gives me a problem in their life, I have certain advantages. One, I'm removed from the kind of the emotional center of the problem. So if they're dealing with something that has a lot of, you know, like charged feelings, I'm not part of that. I can look at it more objectively. Then I think like, well, you know, I like working through problems. I like looking at things and think of trying to kind of conceive of what is like the fairest or most reasonable way to resolve this. Even if I was in that situation, maybe I might react differently. I do feel like I can say, this is what an ethical person would do. And then I like the fact that so much of my writing in the past was just, I don't know, maybe a little too reliant on the voice. That it really wouldn't matter what I was writing about. It would just be the voice of the writing, and that would and I could get away maybe sometimes with poor reasoning if I could sort of make a colorful, interesting argument. And this kind of forces me to write in a confined space and be very clear, knowing that the issue that I'm writing about is going to basically be a kind of a flip of the coin. That I'm consciously looking for questions that can go either way, that are as equal as possible. So it's kind of a writing obstruction. I feel like it could make me better at writing.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm crazy.
You've said, yeah, and I guess it would change you. I mean, you too have acknowledged that you have changed your opinions about things that you've written in some of the earlier books, a couple of which we have here. You're not as harsh as you once were towards certain rock bands, for example. You allow that perhaps there is a place in the world for the Eagles to exist as a concept, at least, or nothing more. So you've seen yourself evolve as a writer. Has it been how does that change then what you end up writing, like what you write now as compared to what you
the first book I started writing, I started writing it when I was 27 or 26. I don't feel like I have any relationship with that person anymore.
Really?
I mean, it seems like I've had so many different experiences. I mean, that's the weirdest thing about not just writing, I suppose any kind of celebrity or public life. You put these things out, and you're the consumer that's really frozen in time. So somebody comes up to me and talks to me about my first book. If they've just read it, they're talking to that person, That's always been a complicated thing, which, of course, you don't realize. But first, when you're trying to write a book, you just want to get it published. So the idea that somehow this is going to impede the person you are later, you'd never think of that. I've written 8 books now. It's a very pretentious thing to say, but I kind of almost feel like it's one big book. That, like, if somebody, for whatever reason, wanted to understand what I'm like or how I have matured or whatever, the trajectory of those books would be a way to understand it. So, the work I do now and the work I did in the past, I'm the person doing it, but it does feel different. And that's, I'm not, if you, like, you've been on the radio and you've been on television. This must happen to you. Let's say you run into somebody from college or high school you've lost track of, but they've kind of been able to keep up with you.
Yeah.
But for you, they're like frozen in that position. It's weird how life works this way.
That's very true, actually. Yeah. There was a piece recently it was a James Wolcott piece in Vanity Fair that was really interesting. He was talking about the branding of writers. I don't know whether you saw the piece or not. And he talked about how he was so lucky to have grown up as a journalist, or developed as a journalist, as he put it, as only James Wolcott can put it, when all he had to do was climb Pork Chop Hill and take long rests in the foxholes in between, and not have to worry about 24 hours a day maintaining your Twitter account and your Facebook account and this and that and the other. That it seems so exhausting to be a writer now with a brand. One almost gets the sense that the Chuck Klosterman brand is out there, and you've got to sort of keep going full time to maintain it. Is that the case?
Well, I mean, I think most people who are writers would hate that term. I mean, I know that I do as it applies. I know that, first of all, I know that there's reality in that.
Yeah.
And that it's to my advantage to have that happen. That my ability to keep writing books in perpetuity is greatly increased by the idea that there is an identity with the writer that almost supersedes or transcends the actual content. But of course, as the person making the content, I don't want that to be the case. I want the content to be the main thing people read. The exhaustive part, yeah, that's true. Like, okay, it's just a... Part of me wants to say, like, well, you only have to put in as much time as you want, and then that's your choice. You can build this brand, or you can not do it. But in some ways, that's not true. I mean, if I'm going to expect a publisher to pay me money in advance for work, I don't know if it's reasonable to say, like, here's the deal, though. I'm not doing anything to make these sales. That's your job. I'm just writing.
Right.
Okay? I could do that, and then it would be totally understandable for them to say, like, well, we're probably going to be a little. I mean, we're a little less supportive of. You know, there's.
Who do you think you are, Salinger?
Well, I mean, but Salinger was interesting. It's an example of somebody whose reclusiveness became the greatest possible.
That's right, exactly.
Like that was there. No, he had, you know, he wrote Catcher in the Rye, and he wrote all these great stories. Nothing is as important to his iconography and his legacy as his removal from society. Thomas Pynchon is kind of the same way.
Yeah.
Like those guys, in a way, are brilliant. Like it would have been. I sometimes think about this. You know, I was so. When I talk about being a different person, like now you know, people tweet at me. I almost never tweet back. I try to avoid that. In my very first book, before the internet was so central to everything, I put my home phone number in that book.
Whoa.
Thinking no one would ever call it, but of course many people did. You know, like many people did. You know,
they're not always nice, are
yeah,
they?
what I really thought is when I did that. No, they were all nice.
Oh, they were?
Well,
Oh, okay.
I mean, this was like, you know, the early 2000s. They were always shocked I answered the phone. They always assumed it was going to like try to sell them T-shirts or something. But you know, at that time, when I was in that position, I guess the idea of sort of connecting with people just seemed really electrifying to me. And I really didn't think people would call, but I thought, to be totally honest, people reviewing the book would see that and go like, this guy is crazy. You know, I thought that would make it seem sort of like a funny thing. Like he put his phone number in this book for no reason. That's in the introduction of the book. Now, I would never do anything like that. Now, so I think to myself, like, you know, what changed about me? What made me actively try to do that at one point, and now the exact opposite is the case? You know, I'm not totally sure, but I do wonder, what if I had been the exact opposite? I would have never given interviews. I would have never been photographed.
Right.
The only thing that anybody would have had any relationship with was the actual text. I think that I would not be as probably successful as it turns out I am, or was, or could be, or whatever. But it would feel as though the writing would matter more. Now I always wonder. Like I always wonder if I wrote my next book and I used a pseudonym, if no one would buy it, or would people buy it? I have no idea.
Yeah. You should try it and see. No, you might not. No, maybe you don't want to do that.
Yeah,
I take that suggestion back. I wanted to ask you a little more seriously, because this is something I came across and I was quite surprised by. Again, because thanks to the internet, I found this thing on the Huff Post, in the parents section of the Huff Post, from a guy who had written an open letter to you about you using what he referred to as the. Was it a woman? Oh, I thought it was a guy. Sorry, okay, it was a woman. You using the R word, and I have to confess, for the longest time I went the R word. What? And then all of a sudden it struck me, of course, and it's a term referred to people who have intellectual problems and disabilities, and I guess you, and I don't know what the reference was that you had said, but at some point you had used that word, I guess, and she was kind of taking you to task for it. And this piece that I found was a description of your response to that thing, which I thought was quite astonishing. And this person basically said, the world has changed. That's what they said. The world has changed because you did what you did. What was it that you did? How did it start? What was it that you did?
Okay, in Fargo Rock City, which is, like I said, I wrote like when I was 27. I think in Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs. And one time in like a public interview, I used the word retard pejoratively, which I will admit we used all the time growing up. Okay, now that's not an excuse for it. That's an unfair thing, you know. Now, do I think it's the same as like a racial epithet or something? I don't. Okay, but the thing is, I don't get to decide these things. Like, the culture decides basically what is or isn't acceptable. And I realize now that the way, like, the world is, like, if you make a mistake, you can just try to ignore it entirely. But I'm also working as the ethicist of the New York Times that raises the stakes of things. I'm not just, if it had just been an autonomous thing, maybe I would have felt differently. But I was like, you know what? I'm just going to apologize for this. I do feel bad. Of course I don't want to make people feel bad. I have a kid now myself. I wouldn't, if there was something wrong with my kid, I wouldn't want people. So I was like, you know what? I'm just going to apologize, do the best I can, and see what, And it turns out that was a good move.
Yeah. I mean, what she said was, you said, I'm sorry, I was wrong, you were right. Yeah. And then you gave a big chunk of money to some organization, did you not?
Yeah.
And that really sealed the deal.
Yep, weirdly.
But were you surprised at then her reaction in the thing that I saw, the post, about how moved they were by what you did? Or did you just think that they would accept it and that would be the end of that?
Well, You know, so much of this is technologically based that we now have a technology that allows people to mobilize. Like, it used to be one thing, you read something and you didn't like it, you'd be like, I hate this guy.
Yeah.
But now
Letter to the editor, maybe.
Maybe,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Now the idea is, can I get enough people to sort of change this person's life, change this person's career, or if I can't do that, at least sort of make a point. So, you know, it's like when they were upset about something, I was this terrible person, I apologize, and I'm this great person.
Yeah, you were.
You know, it was like, it was, yeah. So, I mean, I still feel weird about it. I have extremely conflicted feelings over the whole thing.
Yeah,
but, yeah.
In our last couple of minutes, I wanted to ask you about your actual, the exercise, the practice of writing, the skill and the craft. Are you a disciplined writer? Do you have set times when you write and know that you have to do a certain amount a day and that sort of thing? Or how do you
Well, when I started, you know, I'd work during the day, and I would write books from about 10 o'clock at night till 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning. That's kind of, that to me, that was the best time to write. Then I got into a pretty serious relationship, and of course you can't do it at night then, so I moved to the afternoons. Now I have a kid, I've moved earlier in the morning. Now, you know, so I usually write from, you know, 9 a.m. to 2 in the afternoon. But my style is no style. So, like, when people ask about rituals, and that's a very common question, like a young writer will say, like, what's your writing rituals?
Yeah.
I always wonder if I said something insane if they do it. It's like I smoke 15 cigarettes, and then I look at a picture of a parrot, and then I write.
That's right.
Like when they go, like, okay, I'm doing that now.
I'm like Hemingway. I only write standing up
Yeah.
at a typewriter. And
So,
then, yeah.
you know, newspapers were good about that. Is newspapers sort of train you to be able to write anywhere, at any time, in any place.
Yeah.
So to me, what I do is I just, I think of what I want to write about, and I kind of think about it constantly for a couple days. I think about it when I'm at the computer, but also when I'm at the gym or when I'm watching television or just goofing around. So then when I do write, I can write it really fast. Like, it's already sort of, I mean, the metaphor I often use is it's sort of like it's like a ball of yarn that's all kind of wound together, and it's in your mind. So all the thoughts are there, and then writing is just straightening it out. So the longer you kind of let that ball sort of like tighten and interweave sort of, I feel you can pull it out faster.
Huh. Yeah. So you're not a big rewrite guy, then, I would assume, if you're leaving everything to...
Rewriting, I think, has changed a lot again because of technology. Like, I mean, I can't imagine what it would be like to write a book on a manual typewriter, to write something and then totally rewrite it. I mean, I'm always rewriting as I write. I mean, if you could see the computer screen while I was typing, it would be like I would form a sentence, cut it back this way, add this, cut it back, go all the way again, go back. Like, it's like I'll rewrite a sentence 4 times, but all at once. Like, it's just, you know.
Oh, jeez. I get a headache just thinking of it.
I know.
But it works for you.
Well, it is. I mean, you know, things just kind of work out. I mean, like, the only high school class I ever quit was typing, based on the premise, why would I ever need to type? I can't believe I did it. I can't believe I quit that class. So now I type like a Tyrannosaurus Rex. I use like these 3 fingers, and I can type very fast doing that. But I often wonder if I could actually type, would I have written
4
16
more
books?
books. There you
Yeah.
go. There you go. All right. We've run short of time, Chuck. This has been great.
Well, hey, great meeting.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Nice meeting you.
Thanks.